Now, the first two videos I did were about political ideologies and then the far past and the 20th century and the lessons of the 20th century and the different ideological roots that came about. And this video is going to be about the recent past, the near future, and the further future. So let's get started. I think a lot of people don't fully grasp the disruptive effect of the, first of all, collapse of the Soviet Union and the great bipolar world that existed. When I say bipolar, I don't mean manic depressive. I mean two superpower systems. So you had the United States and the Soviet Union, and one of those disappeared. And I talked in the previous episode about how there were three different secular humanist ideologies that came about. There was liberal humanism, which was the worldview and narrative of the United States. There was socialist humanism, which is the worldview and narrative of the communist nations like the Soviet Union and China. And there was evolutionary humanism, which was the worldview and narrative um, of Nazi Germany. And it's important to know what I mean when I say narrative. So a narrative is a way of viewing the world, a story that our mind composes, in which generally it's pretty simple. We individually and the groups that we are part of are the heroes and the others are the villains. And that's how everybody views their internal narrative. And it's pretty much a function of human consciousness to compose narratives out of sensory information. The thing in our head, our brain, our intelligence is our intelligence is one part of what our brain does, but consciousness is another part of what our brain does. And that's what makes us uniquely human. Moving forward, we're going to have more artificial intelligence, which is going to be the intelligence without the consciousness. And what our consciousness is the creation of stories. So whether it's religious stories, the notion of gods, whether it's monetary stories like currencies, or national stories like mythological origins of your country. Ultimately, these are shared myths. And the author that I brought up in the previous video, Yuval Noah Harari, discusses in his books how shared fictions, shared stories, basically shared abstractions, are what allow large quantities of people to cooperate, and what has allowed human society to basically develop as far as it has and as rapidly as it has. Otherwise, we would just be like any monkey, basically. So it's not just our tools, it's our ability to tell stories and build tools and elaborate systems based on those stories. What is a currency but a shared belief in a value, right? And then you get value systems and things like that. Now, the worldview that was first to fall away. Remember, there were three worldviews. The first one to collapse was the one that was fostered by Nazi Germany, which was evolutionary humanism. After the world saw the horrors of the Holocaust, after World War II ended with the atomic bombings, that one was pretty much kaput. Granted, it still exists in certain circles, and there are still ideologues that believe in Nazi theories and in racial theories and whatnot. But for the most part, that one fell away as a serious global threat, and or at least got fragmented and went underground in certain places like Argentina. Um, so the secondary ideology worldview that collapsed was communism, or I should say, um, uh, socialist humanism, which fell away largely with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then it became a one-story world where you have liberal humanism as the one remaining narrative, which defines the global system. So you end up with people saying, well, what do we do now? And the creation of, you've probably heard this term before, a new world order, and the idea of the United States is the only superpower left, and let's try to build the world in its image. Let's try to promote democracy everywhere. Let's try to have an integrated global system. You, instead of the traditional ideas of what liberals were, which, as I mentioned in the original of these three videos, liberals became conservatives, and then you have progressive ideology. These kind of get shunted aside to an extent, and new ideas come about, which are um, uh, neoconservatism and neoliberalism. And neoconservatism is the idea of, let's try to go out and intervene in other countries and make them more democratic and build them in America's image, in our likeness, and with our value system. And then the second idea, neoliberalism, was, let's try to have global markets and globalism, and sort of the market is the ultimate savior of everyone. So they were pretty ideological in their own right, and they really came to define the mindset and the global order that existed post Cold War. And that's what we've been living with ever since. And these ideas have started to flicker. There's a lot of resentment as what has basically ossified into what is now the establishment, what you would call the establishment, which is neoliberal and neoconservative interests together. And people are really disillusioned with this system. And so the notion of that final narrative, which unifies people and a lot of nations and groups all over the world, known as liberal humanism, that is starting to flicker, and people are starting to lose trust in that narrative. Now, when that fully occurs, you have no narratives left. So that is where people are freaking out. Just like I said before, when people left the traditional religious narrative and they developed um, secular narratives, which became religions in their own right, once again, we're at a point where people need a new thing to jump onto, to leapfrog onto, and there's nothing there. There is no shared narrative right now. And that is what is largely contributing to the chaos that we see around us. So the challenge for, as I mentioned at the end of the second segment, the previous little episode that I just made, it's incumbent upon the thinkers to effectively devise a new narrative. Generally, more intelligent people, they don't need a narrative as much. They can compose their reality from different bits of information rather than having to wholesale take on a belief system. And many people require that narrative to basically be able to live a principled life. So people, from what I've been able to gather, who are more highly intelligent, can better able, are more capable of dealing in the abstract, of thinking in abstractions and understanding abstractions. And principles, like moral principles, are abstract, and they are more able to say, oh, okay, why should I not lie, cheat, steal? Well, because that leads to a better society, and it's in the interest of society in the long run. It's sort of like, it's sort of forward thinking, whereas historically you would have to bake those abstract principles into narrative for the mass majority of people to be able to relate to it and understand it and follow, or be convinced to abide by those. So like, hey, if you don't follow these principles, these moral principles, then this sky guy will throw a lightning bolt at you, or strike you down, or burn you in a pit of fire for eternity, or uh, your country will look upon you in shame, whatever. So it's it's important to realize that we're at a point where we've run out of track before our feet and we're sort of walking on open air right now, and we need to construct that narrative and construct those new institutions for the coming renaissance and rebirth, basically, and create the narrative to wind around those institutions and to sort of build up people's belief in this new iteration of the American and global system. So this brings me to the next thing, which is the massive disruption, aside from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the massive disruption of the internet. So think about how before the internet, people's access to information was composed of what they saw through their senses, which is often flawed. Not totally. You should trust to some extent what your senses see. But like, for example, if I look at the horizon and I see a flat line and I say, okay, well, the earth is flat. Or if I look at the sun in the sky, I say, well, the sun's revolving around the earth. So not everything that you perceive with your senses is absolute reality. Um, so there's what you see with your senses, and then there's what the media and generally the mass media and books uh, make available to you. So that was what was the information that was available to you in the past, and there were many gateways, or I should say gatekeepers, to information, and media could effectively create a single narrative or choose which pieces of information to present as a story, and people would just basically buy into it because that is what the gatekeepers had selected, and people would say, okay, well, why shouldn't I trust that? So things were pretty stable. You kept people in line with the same set of views. Edward Bernays in Public Relations, look it up. It's really interesting, but I'm not going to get into it here. I've talked about it in a previous podcast. But um, the internet basically blew all of that up, and it made all information accessible to anyone who wanted to see it at any time. So any narrative or any idea can be instantly argued against or disproven. And if the more intelligent people tend to be more capable of seeing signal through noise, but most people are still seeing largely noise, and it's just completely not understandable garble with all this information, this fire hose of information hitting everybody in the face at once, and it's just unfiltered. So naturally, there would be a tendency for people to seek somebody who could give them simple stories again and promise simple things and promise simple understanding and simple villains and a return to simpler times. A demagogue, if you will. Does this sound familiar? So the nature of not having the nature of institutions being at their most broken and corrupt and sclerotic, and narrative being at its weakest, makes society vulnerable for convulsions, for revolutions, for wars, for demagogues. And that is the situation that we are in right now. The internet completely blew the gates off of uh, the information that we have available to us. And it completely, we're still dealing with how it is changing society. We don't fully comprehend it, and you can tack social media on top of this. The internet brought about social media and increase in digital communications and sharing of information in ways that is just insane and unprecedented. In the library of information that you have available to you, the power, the knowledge that is available to you if you are willing to pursue it and learn from it, is staggering. And unfortunately, most people don't use the tool of the internet and social media for a productive end. It remember, it is a tool and you can use it for extremely noble purposes or create wonderful things from it. But most people, what they do with it is like a toddler with a gun. They basically uh, become chaotic and they don't know the power of the thing that they use, and they choose to engage in uh, Jerry Springer antics and uh, ripping each other apart. It's sort of like Lord of the Flies, if you remember that book, where people just they think they're anonymous, or they often are anonymous, and they will just be brutal to each other. And you see the darker sides of human nature play out with social media and with this tool that people are addicted to. They get the dopamine hits from. They're addicted to outrage, and which they don't know how to wield properly. Most people. Now, it's it's where I'm trying to think about how exactly I want to pivot here. Okay, so we're going into an era of crisis right now, or we're in crisis and we're going into deeper crisis. And I've mentioned this concept a couple times in the podcast before, but there's a book called The Fourth Turning. I highly recommend that you uh, skim the description of it on Wikipedia, watch some videos about it on YouTube. But the notion is that time is fairly cyclical, and that we have these social patterns that develop where the whole originally the concept of time was just everything was random and chaotic, and things would happen and you would have no explanation to them. And that was sort of the dark ages mindset of like, how would we be able to predict this? Our access to information is so limited. And then there was a shift towards more cyclical time, and that was generally like largely developed through agriculture and planetary movements, seasonal changes, things like that, rotations of clocks and sundials and all that. And then the most recent iteration is progress. So you have the actual timeline. You think about history class in its basic form. It's seeing the timeline and human progression through the ages. So that way back when humans were hunter gatherers, humanity was stable for like thousands and thousands of years and nothing was occurring. Then you have agriculture and it stays pretty stable, but then you start to get basic developments over time, which are hugely wonderful for humanity in total, but don't really change humanity that much. So, the invention of wheels and simple machines and uh, the like fireworks and stuff like that here and there over time. And then you hit the Industrial Revolution and shit just starts taking off. And all of a sudden, like everything that we know today was basically conceived of in the last 200 years, primarily within the last 50 years. So you get people who are primarily traveling through domesticated animals like horses to people uh, flying into outer space and landing on the moon. And the airplane, in a span of decades, moving from a concept that was made out of, I don't know, paper and wood at Kitty Hawk with the Wright brothers to an entire international global system of of sky ships that send people everywhere they want to go all the time whenever they want for relatively cheaply. So that's just one development, and then you just add all of the human progress that's occurred over the last century in particular, and it is insane. So what people don't realize is that we are at the, just like in the movie not the global warming, the Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore, where you see humanity or you see the temperature change or sea level rise going up at a steep angle. All of a sudden it's gradual, then all of a sudden it's steep, it's exponential. That is where humans are right now, and we are about to get launched through a cannon when it comes to numerous simultaneous developments and institutional changes occurring at a rapid pace that will be extremely difficult to wrap our minds around and understand if we aren't thoughtful and sharing of intelligence. So going back to the fourth turning for a sec, basically we're going into a deeper crisis. What the fourth turning says is that is with this notion of progressive time. Yes, humanity is advancing towards more progress, and we are about to hit the steep incline of exponential change. But um, there is a cyclical nature to human development and progress isn't always um, forward. Like it basically there's a forward component to it, but we have setbacks, we have crises. So what they say is almost like a bicycle moving forward through the rotation of the wheels. The rotation of these social cycles is what causes society to move forward, and they trace back the American system and the English system, social systems, through the last, like, I don't know, 3 centuries or something like that. And you basically have these cyclical occurrences called seculums, which are about 80 to 100 years. And it's like going through all the seasons of a year or the phases of a lifetime, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, elderhood, or spring, summer, fall, winter. So the idea is you go through 4 20 to 25-year periods that compose one revolution of this cycle, and the cycle is composed of a crisis, a high, an awakening, and an unraveling. And different things predictably, although they develop differently during each cycle, happen during those periods. And the generations, very interestingly, that are born during those different periods and that grow up during those periods are shaped very much. Their worldview is shaped by what is occurring in the state of society at any given point in that evolution. So just as human beings individually, or I should say as a species, develop over time, societies have a way of developing over time as well. So it's very, like, I don't know, meta or fractal or something like that. Um, look fractal up on YouTube. I'm not going to explain that either. That's a math thing. It's like self-similarity, but it's going to be very interesting, because what they suggest and why the book is called The Fourth Turning is because going back through the crises, the crises that have formed the history of the United States were the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, and World War II, and now we are going through our fourth crisis. And so once you go through a crisis, you have a period of rebuilding and social uh, renaissance and civic mindedness and institution building, and all the old, dead, broken institutions and ideas of the previous cycle basically get burnt away during the crisis. The resentments start to ease up. People start to realize that they're petty, and then they come together and they say, what can we do? How can we make society better? How can we improve on the previous cycle? How can we integrate all the new ideas that came about? And you just have a creative renaissance. And that's what happened after World War II. You had the creation of the suburbs, of all the interstates, people setting their society setting its eyes on the moon, and all these human developments in medicine and ways of living and ideas. So it's pretty incredible, and we're headed for that. But the unfortunate thing is shit's about to get worse before it gets better. And I know I'm not the only person saying that. It's probably a cliche at this point. But basically, if you think about COVID, a lot of people right now are looking at it as if it's the main event. And I don't take what the authors Strauss and Howe, the authors of The Fourth Turning, say as gospel, but their prediction is that the crisis is basically it goes in phases, and it gets worse and worse, and then eventually you break through. But if you think about the crisis of the Great Depression and World War II, the worst shit was during pretty much, I mean, I'm not trying to dismiss the Depression here, but the worst shit was probably during World War II when it came to the just downright awfulness of it. So the worst things happen towards the end of a crisis period. And the prediction is that it's going to go at least until 2025, probably at most until 2030. So the election of Trump, the 2008 financial crisis, that was all early stuff, early phase crisis. COVID is basically like, you need to, people are looking at it like it's the main event. You need to look at it more like it is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. If you're not a history person, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was the thing that basically lit the match, that blew the powder kegs, that were the alliance system that started World War One, and then World War One eventually caused World War Two, and yeah. So this is, COVID is an accelerant, and it will accelerate a lot of processes of change that were already occurring for the better, and in the more immediate, it will feel like for the worse. But it's necessary that um, a lot of this chaos occur so that there can be rebirth on the other side of it. Unfortunately, we have a system that is based largely on debt and consumption, and I talk about that in a previous episode too. We have a Ponzi system that basically relies on the growth of the system and spends tremendous amount of money recklessly and prints money and kicks the can down the road of ever paying that debt, and encourages people to live lifestyles of consumption and taking on more and more debt to finance the mm, kind of typical notion of what it is to live the American dream, which was built up in the 50s. The idea of living in a suburb, having a home, having a car, having a vacation home, having whatever, acquiring status symbols through your career, all of that stuff. Even the people who say, well, I don't do that stuff, I live frugally, unfortunately, those people tend to have a portfolio that relies on other people being reckless and consumptive and taking on debts that they can't afford to take on. So the chickens have come home to roost, and the thing that will ironically light this all off is the virus, where you have the accumulation of unpaid debts and unpaid rents and things like that. And there's going to be a little bit of a lag here before that gets through the system, but basically you're going to get this accumulation of defaults, and then it's going to pick up pace, and then that's probably going to coincide with economic collapse around the time of the election, and then that's going to cast the election into doubt. And then most likely, my prediction has been that Donald Trump will win in 2020. And people tend to, particularly during unpredictable times, want people who they believe are strong. And although I personally don't like Trump, I think he's a demagogue, and I think he unfortunately, people try to say he's a Nazi and stuff like that. I don't see him as a Nazi. I see his more the more subtle, dangerous aspect of him, that he's a narcissist. He has narcissistic personality disorder, and he actually will do things primarily for the preservation of his own image and his own self-image and his own brand. And then if that happens to coincide, if the preservation of his brand and his self-image happens to coincide with the what is best for the country, then he will go for that. But he will by no means choose what's best for the country or the world or humanity. It's all against his ego, and that's dangerous. So, but unfortunately, a lot of people are just going to be frightened, and people are going to reach for security, and demagogues promise security, and it's also, we're mid-crisis. So just like during the Civil War, where Lincoln got reelected, people say they don't want to switch horse mid-river, right? So, and not to mention Joe Biden is completely uninspiring. So um, I think that Trump will win, and I think that people are not going to whoever wins, people are not going to take it well. A huge portion of people are not going to take it well at all. But I think that when, like I said, I think that Trump wins, that the progressive side is going to be extremely upset. They're going to call into question the integrity of the election, not only because of the previous election, but also because this is happening in the midst of a crisis, and some people are forced to stay home because of the virus, and during its second round, and other people are just too distracted and too anxious to vote, and then the voting is just going to be completely cast into suspicion and doubt because it's happening with all these other things happening simultaneously. So they're going to, I think, a lot of the more radical people on the left are going to start to protest more heavily and become violent. And then the people who are defenders of Trump are going to take up arms and try to defend the president. And it's going to get ugly and difficult. And I recommend that people sort of, in a metaphorical sense, batten down the hatches and prepare for ugliness, and think about resources, and think about tightening the belt a bit, and about not spending recklessly, and about basically rationing and things like that. Look up previous crises and see how people dealt with those, both emotionally and physically. And do simple things like write down the contacts of people that you know and people who you want to maintain contact with, in case it becomes difficult to reach them through, like in case internet is down, or you know, phone communication is down. Think about stuff like that. Access to resources that you need. And so that's going to be the near future. And then the clouds are going to part, and we're going to emerge from this. And this isn't going to affect everyone equally. I'm not going to pretend that it is. There's going to be that famous term, disparate impact, of this on all different people. So consider that. Help as many people as you can in as many ways as you can, um, and develop an attitude of reciprocity, of getting each other through the crisis. And that's going to be what carries into that sense of common humanity, what carries into the recovery and the rebuilding and the high that comes afterwards. Now, the thing that you should realize that I was talking about before, when it comes to all of these simultaneous developments that are going to bring humanity into this new borderline vertical phase of development and in change, is there are three things that are basically larger than the internet that are going to be happening concurrently, larger than the internet in their impact on humanity, that are going to be happening concurrently. And one of them is the development of artificial intelligence. One of them is modification, using modification of the human body using machine. So, like Neuralink, the thing that Elon Musk is developing, trying to connect biological neural pathways to artificial intelligence into circuitry, basically, and to have a seamless transition between the two. So the internet in your head, being able to communicate with other people without talking, that kind of stuff. Sounds like crazy science fiction. It's happening right now. And then the third thing is genetic modification, CRISPR. Look all these things up. They're going to be interacting with each other in weird ways. And it's possible that there could be another Cold War type situation where you think about the thing that fundamentally ended the crisis in the previous crisis. It was the atomic bombs, the development of a new existential threat, right? And then there was the nuclear age that existed afterward, and people basically started to forget about the the atomic bombs. Not forget about them, but become accustomed to them, and they were always kind of in the background. And it's possible that during this new crisis, the thing that will cap it off and end it is the development of an artificial intelligence, which could become a new existential threat. Is like, it's uncertain how artificial intelligence will be used and how we will develop it and how we can uh, effectively try to trust ourselves with it. But one of the things that is going to be on the table that people are going to start recommending is the only way that we can keep up with it and handle it is to enhance or modify ourselves, either um, machine, genetically, or a combination of both. And effectively, at some point, what is called intelligent design, which is choosing how people are going to change over time, is going to overtake natural selection's gradual process. And you're going to have changes to the human form and what is considered what we know of as Homo sapien. We're going to basically create a new species of us in a generation or two. So we've picked up the pace of evolution by like a significant amount, and that is the vertical that I'm talking about of human change. So yeah, some of the biggest things that we need to do as these occur is keep in mind that that intelligence is going to be a dividing line between people, and to try to bridge the gaps and keep society as simple as we can, and to understand that not everybody is going to be able to comprehend what's going on in the same way, and people are going to reach for simpler solutions in simpler times, and there's going to be an intense urge for demagoguery and violence and a return to the past for a lot of people. And we also need to realize that the other dividing line that's going to come about is a generational dividing line, where basically it's going to become increasingly more difficult for generations to relate to each other and to understand each other because of the unprecedented pace of technological advancement and how that shapes each couple of years. I mean, the whole originally a generation is 20 years. It's going to shrink to like 2 or 3 years because things are happening so quickly that instead of people who are 20 years apart from each other being like, yeah, I don't really get those people who are 20 years younger than us, it's going to be people who are 3 years younger than other people, 3 years older than other people being like, yeah, I don't get them. So if we don't focus on maintaining connections and explaining across generational lines and engaging each other, then generations will not, there will be no smooth transition and connectedness between life experiences across generations, which would be a damn shame. So keep these things in mind. We can do it. I am optimistic, but we need to go through this together. Once again, as I mentioned at the end of the previous episode, we need to connect smart people who are willing to think about this, to have open conversations, and to basically have this next phase where we're all going to be stuck at home or dealing with this crisis in some capacity, this worsening crisis. We need to have conversations through the crisis about how we're going to what we're going to create and what we want the system to look like on the other side of the crisis, that integrates these technologies that are coming about, and that integrates the ideas, the better ideas that have come about over the last 70-80 years, and which aren't really fully integrated into society and our systems. So we need to think about it. We need to, this is the seedbed of ideas, and we cannot be caught flat footed when we reach the end of the crisis. So that's all I have to say. I think this was the longest of the three, probably at least 30 minutes. And I'm going to make more of these pretty regularly. So share them. Stay tuned. Good night.